Here you will discover one of the most unsettling tales the Appalachians have ever told about their mist-covered mountains. Where you are currently watching us, please leave a comment below. In West Virginia's highlands, where vast valleys blend with forests, the quiet appears to weigh heavily on its own. The Whitlock family had an isolated estate. Rumors started to spread over the neighboring communities in 1908. Rumors spread by seasonal employees and merchants who delivered goods on a monthly basis, wished not to come back. Standing alone atop a hill, the Whitlock mansion was encircled by thick oak and pine forests that blotted out the sun, even on the brightest afternoons. The austerity of the area contrasted with the Victorian architecture's large windows and elaborate balconies, giving the impression that the structure was attempting to retain some dignity in the face of the surrounding misery. This film was made entirely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any likeness to real people, either alive or deceased, is completely coincidental. In the neighborhood, Ruth Whitlock was regarded as a mysterious individual. On her few excursions to the closest village, her presence evoked equal parts intrigue and discomfort. She always wore black clothing that seemed to absorb the light around her, and she moved with an almost theatrical elegance. But those who encountered her were troubled by something more than just her beauty. It was the sensation of being surrounded by someone who was divided, as though two people had switched places within the same body. The villagers avoided staring into her eyes, claiming that the depth of her stare varied depending on the day. It could be chilly and aloof, like an Appalachian winter, or warm and inviting. In the area, the Whitlock family's reputation remained unclear. Edmund Whitlock, the patriarch, was rarely seen and preferred to use middlemen to run his mining and timber companies. Employees who later left the company reported that his wife, Constance, had turned into a shadow in her own house. Service. The property operated virtually independently with its own set of laws and dynamics that were completely incomprehensible to outsiders. The main gate was where deliveries were dropped off. The few employees signed confidentiality agreements that were uncommon at the time, and few people were invited outside the entryway. At least it was thought that Ruth had a twin sister. Nobody in the nearby villages was certain if the two women in suits were real, or if Ruth was the only one. Her unsettling shifts in disposition and demeanor. Although there was only one birth recorded in the county, witnesses swore they had seen two identical women on different dates, never together, and always apart due to what appeared to be meticulously planned conditions. In that mansion, an invisible dance was taking place, a performance that kept everyone apart and stoked gloomier rumors. There were especially many mirrors in the Whitlock house. There was at least one in every room. There were some bedrooms with 3 or 4, arranged to produce an infinite number of reflections. The family's fascination with reflected surfaces, including polished silver mirrors, ancient Venetian mirrors, and even basins of still water on marble pedestals, was noted by servants who passed through the mansion. It seemed as though the entire house was built to create many presences, making it difficult for the spectator to determine the true number of individuals who lived in those quiet hallways. And Ruth, or whomever she was, thought about these surfaces for hours occasionally. Sometimes she was talking softly to her own reflection, and other times she was just watching with a focus that seemed to reach through the glass. When the episodes started, the tension on the site became evident. Overnight, objects are moving. From seemingly unoccupied rooms, female voices may be heard in implausible discussions. Most significantly, the finding of 2 identical outfits, 2 hairbrushes with identically colored and textured bristles, 2 beds made up in mirrored rooms on opposite sides of the estate. None of the servants stayed long enough to validate their suspicions, but they all came up with their own hypotheses and accounts of what happened. There was frequent staff turnover, and those who departed said little more than nods in response to questions, and left on their own. That fall of 1911, The Appalachian fog seemed to have a life of its own, shrouding the Whitlock estate in dense layers that made the world outside the gates seem far away and surreal. Ruth kept up her intermittent appearances in. Even the merchants who were used to peculiarities were disturbed by the village's constant loneliness and dual presence. On certain days when she placed orders for supplies and clothing, her voice sounded sweet and soothing. On other occasions, the same woman demanded quite different things with a precision that verged on obsession, speaking with a crisp hardness that was almost male in her power. Because of her, the people created a strange sort of etiquette. Nobody brought up the discrepancies. When she denied requests that were clearly documented in the accounting books or asked for something she had already sought for days earlier, no one questioned her. Accepting the scenario as one of the many strange things the mountains hid was easier. A domestic mystery that is not worth the risk of a thorough investigation. Traditional families in the area have long understood that some secrets are best kept hidden in the hill's shadows. Within the mansion, the atmosphere became more dense. Constance Whitlock was in a room with a view of the woods to the north, having totally withdrawn to the upper wings. Edmund, her husband, stayed in his lodgings on the other side and took care of business through letters that came and went with exacting regularity. Ruth moved easily between these two poles of the home. Or maybe there were two Ruths. Nobody knew for sure. At unreasonable hours, the hallways resounded with her footsteps, occasionally rising. The stairs, but the same sounds concurrently emanated from the upper floor, as though the house's design worked together to maintain the mystery. The mirrors continued to grow. They ordered new ones from far-off cities' antique dealers. Exquisite items that came in bulky packages with frames made of gold and silver. Ruth personally oversaw the installation of each one, selecting particular angles and making millimeter-by-millimeter adjustments until the reflections formed pleasing patterns. In specific areas of the home, one may see themselves repeatedly dozens of times, a never-ending gallery of pictures that vanished into the glass's false depth. Infrequent guests, the few that were still welcomed, spoke of feeling as though there were unseen throngs all around them, watching through the gleaming surfaces. There was conjecture over the correspondence between Ruth and her purported twin sister. The property frequently received letters, some of which were sent to Ruth Whitlock and others too. Someone by the name of Rebecca Whitlock, whose name was not in any official documents that interested bystanders could locate. The local postman, a discreet man named Thomas, reportedly described witnessing Ruth accept the letters, open them at the gate, and react with a wide range of facial emotions as she read them. At times, she would smile affectionately, and at other times she would pale, as if she had received terrible news. Thomas simply shrugged when asked if the letters were sent from a great distance, adding that the postage stamps showed senders from West Virginia itself, occasionally from nearby regions. Edmund Whitlock's condition started to deteriorate. His formerly successful companies started to experience mysterious losses. Contracts were terminated without obvious cause. Partners withdrew, claiming they were uncomfortable with family customs, though they never gave specifics. Like hillsides ravaged by relentless rain, the Whitlock fortune, which had been built on decades of meticulous exploitation of the mountain's natural riches, started to fall apart. Edmund used to lock himself. He avoided making eye contact with any family members and spent days at his office, only coming out for silent meals. As each week went by, his posture became more and more slumped, as though he were carrying an unseen weight. Whitlock Manor remained enshrouded in its own unique mystery as the seasons changed. Ruth, or the Ruths, carried on with their vague lives, vacillating between overlapping but never entirely defined realities. Fragmented truths were reflected by the mirrors, with each surface providing a significantly warped variation of the same scene, and the lines between original and reflection, between individual and projection, between singular personality and the incomprehensible multitude that inhabited those walls of dark wood and stone, were no longer distinguishable. In 1913, the Whitlock estate became a fortress of ice and solitude as winter brought its typical ruthlessness to the highlands. A family that was already living on the outskirts of the estate was further isolated by the thick amounts of snow that accumulated around it. Social life. Deliveries became irregular and restricted to necessary goods that were left at the gate and picked up by invisible hands at night. With the exception of sporadic muttered remarks in taverns, when liquor loosened tongues and ancient tales reappeared like ghosts, the closest village all but forgot the existence of Whitlocks. That winter, Ruth made one final appearance, walking through the snow to the city with a resolve that shocked the few who saw her. Her black gown stood out sharply against the spotless white of the surroundings, leaving a lasting impression on those who saw it. She went into the fabric store and asked for something out of the ordinary. Using the same crimson fabric she had bought, she made two similar outfits that were cut precisely to the same design and had the same measurements. A superior quality cloth that gleamed even in the store's low light. The seamstress, well familiar with that client's quirks, took the order without inquiry. Ruth waited, sitting by the window, and noticed how little was happening on the street. Her face wavered between intense calm and outward signs of discomfort, as though she were speaking to herself in a private voice that no one else could see. Later, the passing merchant remarked on how bizarre it was to see her move her lips silently while making small hand gestures, as though she were communicating something crucial to a hypothetical conversation partner. When the costumes were finished, Ruth paid them handsomely, expressed her gratitude in an overly polite manner, and retreated once more into the icy terrain, her figure getting smaller and smaller until the white expanse of the hills engulfed her. The mirrors at the home were no longer just ornamental pieces. They appeared to pulse with their own presence, reflecting unseen motions and shadows in addition to what was in front of them. The passageways were filled with mirrored surfaces, and the few surviving staff, an elderly cook and a hesitant caretaker, avoided going through them. There were accounts of whispers that appeared to come from the silvery depths of the glass, of images that lingered in the mirrors even after the person had left the room, and of reflections that didn't match actual motions. At last, Constance Whitlock came out of her self-imposed seclusion. Her appearance stunned everyone who saw her. She was as pale as the snow outside, and had deep-set eyes that appeared to have studied depths that no human should ever know. At night, she started to roam the estate, carrying a candle that made the walls dance with its shadows. Her actions had grown unpredictable. She would pause in front of each mirror to study her own image with unsettling ferocity, occasionally caressing the chilly surface with her fingertips, as though attempting to move to the other side. Even when food was placed on trays outside his door, Edmund refused to leave his sealed quarters. That was the height of Ruth's dualism. Employees claimed to have seen her in two locations at once, an absurdity that defied logic. Justification. With the same stance, the same motions, and the same expression of melancholy detachment, one Ruth might be in the library looking through old volumes, while another might be strolling through the snow-covered gardens. It was impossible to tell if the red gowns that were ordered were worn by the same lady on different days, or if there were indeed two people who shared not only appearance, but also an inexplicably entwined existence. The letters continued to come in, now with more often. Ruth burnt them in the main room fireplace as soon as she finished reading them, so what was inside remained a complete mystery. On top of the embers, the ashes gathered in black layers, the remains of words that would never be known, secrets that the fire devoured before they could divulge the facts that kept that house torn between fantasy and reality. The caretaker once said that he had witnessed Ruth sobbing in front of the fireplace while clutching a letter that had not yet caught fire. A name that sounded just like her own, pronounced with a tenderness and anguish that chilled the blood of everybody who heard it, was softly repeated in her voice. A troubling Thor arrived in the West Virginia highlands in the spring of 1914. A world that appeared to have aged decades over the months of seclusion was exposed by the melting snow. After that winter, the Whitlock estate was a different place. Its outer walls are smudged with moisture, and the gardens have been neglected, allowing wild vegetation to grow out of control. The mansion appeared to have become a visible manifestation of the residents' emotional state after absorbing all the melancholy that has accumulated throughout the years. At last, Edmund Whitlock let people into his office. The man who came out looked nothing like the successful businessman he had been. His stooped posture suggested he was decades older than he actually was, and his hair had entirely turned white. In the dining room, he called his wife and Ruth to a meeting, an extraordinary move in that home where every member of the family had turned into an island of isolation. The table was arranged in an antiquated manner, as though trying to restore a normalcy that had long since disappeared from those walls. Constance sat quietly with her hands in her lap, shaking a little. Ruth sat down calmly, but her eyes darted all the while, as though she was waiting for someone else to walk in. Edmund started talking about the need for change, the family's need to get back in touch with the outside world, their intentions to sell some of their land, and the possibility of moving to a bigger city, where they could make a fresh start free from the mountain's shadows. He sounded like a man in a desperate attempt to mend something that had already been terribly damaged. Ruth listened in an unreadable manner, occasionally nodding slightly and occasionally grinning barely perceptibly, as though she was amused by a certain joke that only she could understand. Edmund brought up the prospect of them all going together, but Ruth cut him off with a quiet interruption that was full with nuance. "Everybody, are you certain that are you aware of the actual number of us?" The ensuing hush was as dense as the fog of Appalachia. Constance started crying gently, and made no attempt to stop the tears from running down her face. Edmund gave Ruth a confused and almost terrified look, as though he was suddenly realizing that the mystery in his own home was more profound and unsettling than he had ever acknowledged to himself. Ruth got up with grace, straightened her clothing, and walked out of the room without saying anything. Anything more, her footsteps reverberating down the corridors until they vanished into thin air. After that evening, Constance developed a strange infatuation with mirrors. With an almost obsessive intensity, she would spend hours in front of them, analyzing her own reflection. "Are you real? Am I real? Is any of us real?" she would scream out loud to the image staring back at her. The questions went unanswered, lingering like smoke in the mansion's heavy air. The caregiver. One morning, he discovered her sleeping on the main hall floor, cradling one of the Venetian mirrors like a loved one, and whispering names in nightmares he couldn't decipher. Ruth persisted in making 2 appearances on the property. In a physical paradox that defied all natural rules, she was simultaneously visible in the conservatory and the library on the 2nd story. After working with the family longer than any other employee, the Cooka, practical woman finally quit. Prior to departing, she told the caregiver that she had saw something that her mind was unable to comprehend. Ruth, conversing with Ruth, the 2 incarnations seated side by side in the music room, their voices blending in a conversation that sounded like both agreement and disagreement at the same time, as though they were the same person debating herself through an unreal realm. Edmund made one final attempt to bring order to the anarchy that had taken over his house. He employed a physician from a far-off town who had no ties to the area and could examine the situation objectively. On a soggy afternoon, the doctor showed up with a confident, professional demeanor and his battered leather briefcase. Over the course of 3 days, he examined every member of the family, asked insightful questions, and took notes in a notebook he carried with him at all times. His face had transformed entirely by the time he left. The assurance was gone, replaced with a nervous confusion. He simply shook his head and implied that some things were true, refusing to share his findings with Edmund. Were incomprehensible to medical professionals, that certain mysteries were best left unanswered. Letters ceased to come in. As silent witnesses to a truth that no one could explain, the mirrors stayed where they were. And Ruth or the Ruths carried on with their improbable life, alternating between worlds that, like layers of thin glass, overlapped and each told a slightly different version of the same sinister tale. The Appalachian valleys experienced an oppressive heat in the summer of 1915 that seemed to come from the ground itself as well as the sun, as though the mountains were releasing decades' worth of closely held secrets. With its rooms trapping the heated air until it took deliberate effort to breathe, Whitlock Manor turned into a stone and wood furnace. The heavy drapes prevented any attempt at ventilation, and the windows stayed closed regardless the weather, as though the family had given up on daylight and decided to live in the shadows forever. It was around this period that Ruth formed a new habit. One by one, she started to cover the mirrors in the house, one that turned the reflective surfaces into opaque, mysterious rectangles by utilizing dark textiles. Each covered mirror created a sense of loss, as though something essential was being removed from reality, while also seeming to relieve some invisible weight that dragged on the mansion's ambiance. Constance merely observed the slow erasure of the endless reflections that had ruled her life for so long while maintaining a neutral expression. These days, Edmund hardly ever left his rooms. He had completely stopped writing business letters. His desk was piled high with unanswered letters from creditors, and business had quietly fallen apart. Under the unrelenting sun, the family money vanished like morning mist. However, nobody in the home appeared to give a damn about such trivial issues as wealth or social standing. That home was occupied by more pressing issues, problems that went beyond simple basic survival and addressed something more profound, unsettling, pertaining to the essence of existence and identity itself. The sole surviving employee, the caretaker, started recording the odd things he saw every day in his personal journal. His notes described doors opening and closing on their own as if the house were breathing, footsteps going up and down the stairs at times when everyone was allegedly asleep, and voices heard in impossible conversations. He talked about a particularly unsettling night when he woke up to the sound of women laughing in the main. Hall walked downstairs to look into it and discovered that all of the mirrors were vibrating a little, as though something was attempting to force them out, straining to come out of the silvery depths where it had been imprisoned. Ruth started wearing only the red gown she had ordered. There was a visual continuity created by the two similar outfits that alternated in her wardrobe. They were always flawless and well-fitting, making it difficult to keep track of her activities or create a logical timeline of her. Significantly more challenging to navigate around the property. She moved with a spectral lightness along the hallways, occasionally humming old tunes that sounded like distorted lullabies, and occasionally muttering phrases in a language that the caregiver was unable to understand, syllables that appeared to predate all known human languages. Constance started to inquire. She made an effort to learn more about what was going on in her own home for the first time in years. She trailed Ruth throughout the rooms, watching from a distance and taking notes in her head, of all contradictions and impossibilities. "Where is your sister?" she openly asked her stepdaughter one afternoon. Ruth turned slowly, her expression a mask of disconcerting calm, and asked her own inquiry in response. "Which one are you looking for? The one that exists, or the one that should exist?" The response did not provide any clarification. Rather, it widened the gap between those women's understanding. Stains started to appear on the cloths that covered the mirrors. Dark stains. Things materialized inexplicably, gradually growing like shadows and acquiring actual substance. The caregiver attempted to clean a few of them, but the stains appeared to be in the fabric itself, or possibly outside of it, as though they were seeping from a place that existed both inside and outside of physical reality. Ruth's voice had an authority that could not be challenged, and she barred any attempt to remove the cloths. With a coolness that sounded more menacing than a yell, she stressed that the mirrors had to stay covered, that they represented facts that were best left in the shadows and things that should no longer be seen. Edmund tried one final time to interact with the outer world. He attempted to describe his family's predicament in a lengthy, perplexed letter to a distant cousin, but he was unable to clearly state what was wrong. The writing on the paper sounded disorganized, rambling, and lurching from one idea to another without any sense of coherence. He spoke of multiple identities, false reflections, and a house that had been transformed into a prison and a setting for an incomprehensible drama. The letter was never delivered. Days later, it was discovered inside his office's unlit fireplace, ripped into small bits, as though he had stopped seeking assistance. Recognizing at last that the nature of the torment his family lived in could not be described in words. In 1916, autumn returned with winds that howled like old laments through Whitlock Manor's cracks. The leaves rained down in streams of. The gardens were covered in a blanket of crimson and gold that hid years of neglect. The property had taken on an ethereal look, as though it were gradually blending into the surrounding mountains and becoming an unrecognizable part of them. The paint peeled in sheets, exposing layers of long-forgotten colors, while the outside walls had fissures that widened like dark veins. Ruth eventually settled mostly in the mansion's attic, a large space beneath the sloping roof where filthy. Decades' worth of family memories were stored in crates. She had established a sort of private haven there, surrounded by antique trunks and furnishings covered in spectral blankets. The only light in the room came from a single octagonal window that looked northward over the woods. Surrounded by items that seemed to convey quiet tales of generations of Whitlocks who had passed through those same hallways with their own secrets and unique foolishness, she spent whole days in that haven. Constance fell into an unsettling nocturnal pattern. She waited for twilight to start making her pilgrimages throughout the house, going to each covered mirror as though it were an altar that required adoration. With a mixture of fear and reverence, her hands brushed the dark textiles, occasionally pressing her palm against the concealed surface, as though she were attempting to sense the life force of anything trapped on the other side. Disturbed by the woman's transition from the respectable mistress of the property to a ghostly figure hovering in midair, the caretaker observed her from a distance, wearing a white nightgown, her loose hair casting a silvery halo around her mutilated face as she moved through the hallways. Edmund ceased his meal. His meals were returned unopened on trays, where they cooled before being thrown out. It seemed as though he was progressively disappearing from reality as his presence in the house grew more shaky and even translucent. His appearance was startling in its extreme weakness during the few times he was seen. He appeared to have been devoured from within, stripped of everything save a tormented awareness that refused to fully give up on the living world. Ruth's scarlet gowns started to show up in unexpected places. In the library, one would be found neatly draped over a chair, while in the attic, Ruth would be wearing the authora simultaneity that defied logic. Occasionally, both costumes would appear to be worn simultaneously with two identical individuals moving around separate areas of the estate. The caretaker saw this occurrence with increasing terror, yet he had stopped making comments because no one else had any clarity with whom to discuss such insights. The home started making noises of its own, creaks and moans that were not entirely due to the deteriorating building or the wind rustling through the crevices. They had an almost deliberate aspect, as though the stone and wood were attempting to convey a message. The caregiver perceived murmurs that appeared to originate from the walls, voices too quiet to be comprehended, yet loud enough to remain perpetually present on the periphery of awareness. He came up with a theory that the mansion had finally acquired a tortured consciousness trapped within its own materiality, because it had absorbed so many secrets, lies, and whispered truths. That autumn, Ruth came down from the attic just once, bringing an ancient black wooden box with brass locks. She made her way through the hallways with purpose till she arrived at the basement of the house, a region that has been neglected for many years. The caregiver trailed along behind. His curiosity eventually triumphed over his trepidation. The basement turned out to be a maze of tiny, connected rooms, each containing tidbits of family history. As if following some ritual, Ruth set the box in a designated niche on the far wall. The caretaker's feeble flashlight made it difficult to view what looked to be ancient photos, yellowed letters, and other items inside the box. Something that shone in the dark with a metallic glitter. As Whitlock Manor delved farther into its own unique mythology, the seasons carried on with their everlasting dance. The mirrors were still hidden, silent protectors of reflections that were now too frightening to look at. Ruth stood guard in the attic, a lone guardian guarding mysteries that even she might not have fully comprehended. And whatever the reality was, it was still hidden beneath layers of mystery and ambiguity that were as impenetrable as the Appalachian Mountains were shrouded in a never-ending mist. In 1917, winter arrived with a severity that appeared to target the Whitlock estate in particular, as if nature itself were attempting to bury that house and its secrets under unending layers of ice white. Snow built up in jagged mounds against the mansion walls, obstructing the first-floor windows and giving the impression of gradual burial. Ghostly symphonies reverberated through the deserted hallways as piercing winds smashed through every crevice. The internal temperature of even the caretaker, who was used to the idiosyncrasies of the place, was astonished when the mansion plummeted so low that breath could be seen in clouds of steam and the wooden surfaces contracted, creating abrupt creaks. Ruth turned the attic into her permanent home and started living there completely. She had brought heavy blankets, enough food for weeks of seclusion, and a little iron burner above. When the caretaker went up to leave firewood and fresh water, they consistently found the same disturbing scene. Ruth sat in the middle of the dusty attic, surrounded by concentric circles of thoughtfully placed items, including yellowed letters, ancient photos, and tiny personal items that had belonged to earlier Whitlock generations. She moved them around like pieces of a massive jigsaw puzzle that only she could fully see as she studied them with an obsession. Her scarlet gown was a striking contrast to the gray background, a burst of color in a world that appeared to be slowly, completely losing saturation. One of the main hall's covered mirrors had been Constance's obsession. An intricately carved gilded frame featuring scenes from classical mythology was an old Venetian artwork that had arrived from overseas decades prior as a wedding present. She would sit in front of it for hours, thinking about the shiny surface hidden under the black cloth. Her hands were always moving, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air as though they were symbols that only she could decipher. The caregiver saw that she had started whispering names in a low voice, a never-ending list of lengthy, dead-headed Whitlocks, as though calling up spirits from beyond the boundary between realms. She was constantly moving her lips, emitting syllables that were lost in the cold air before they could become whole, understandable phrases. On a particularly chilly morning, Edmund finally came out of his chamber. His appearance had changed so drastically that it was nearly unrecognizable. His beard had become untamed and disheveled. His lengthy hair cascaded in untidy strands over his shoulders, and his eyes had taken on a glassy appearance, as though he was thinking about realities that were not visible to the human eye. Like a sleepwalker, he walked around the house, tentatively touching furniture and walls as though he needed to be sure everything was physically real. Wearing shreds of previous dignity, his clothing hung loosely on a torso that had lost much of its heft, leaving him little more than an animated skeleton. The caretaker chose to investigate the cellar more fully, motivated by a curiosity that ultimately triumphed over his natural fear. He went down the creaky stairs with multiple spotlights, intent on lighting up every inch of that underground area that had always been a mystery. He was extremely troubled by what he found. The cellar, which extended in different directions through tunnels excavated into the living rock of the mountains, was far larger than the house's floor design indicated was conceivable. Some passages appeared to be very old, possibly constructed by the first Whitlocks to settle there. Others seemed more recent, meticulous excavations that traced particular stone veins. The caretaker discovered rooms deep within that underground maze that appeared to have had particular functions in the past. One had shelves brimming with decades' worth of private notes from Whitlock family members, including leather-bound diaries. He randomly opened a few books and used his flashlight's flickering light to read passages. Family was mentioned in the entry. Obsessions that persisted for generations, behavioral patterns that appeared periodically, akin to inherited curses. Unsettlingly often, twins were mentioned. Stories of siblings who experienced such deep psychological symbiosis that their distinct identities vanished into something hybrid and indescribable, sharing not only appearance but also thoughts. What could only be called a portrait gallery, but with a macabre peculiarity, was in another room. Every painting showed two identical twins posing side by side with looks that ranged from barely concealed horror to mutual adoration. The bronze plaques attached to the frames bore dates spanning over a century, indicating that the Whitlock lineage's propensity for twin births had been a consistent trait. Certain portraits displayed evidence of ancient vandalism, with faces painted over or scratched, suggesting that subsequent generations tried to obliterate the memory of especially problematic forebears. At last, the caregiver discovered the room at the bottom of the underground labyrinth, the furthest away. There was only one large, uncovered mirror in this room, and the lantern's light was reflected in mesmerizing patterns on its surface. At least 3 meters in height, it was a remarkable piece that seemed to have grown naturally into the rock wall. The frame had inscriptions in a language he didn't understand and was made of a dark metal he couldn't identify. The caretaker experienced a sudden dizziness as he got closer, as if his feet were on a tilted ground. A nauseating feeling of imperfect duplication resulted from his reflection in the mirror, appearing to be a fraction of a second out of sync with his real movements. Behind him, Ruth materialized out of the shadows with a haunting silence. As though she had always known that he would eventually find that place, she displayed a serene resignation rather than surprise at finding him there. As she got closer to the big mirror, her image multiplied in. Unfeasible paths on the sloping terrain. Then, the caregiver saw something that made his blood run cold. There was more than just Ruth's image in the mirror, as though two overlapping images were attempting to fill the same space in the silvery glass. There was another figure that was exactly like her but slightly off-center. For a scary moment, it appeared as though Ruth's hand would breach the mirror and the boundary between reality and reflection would entirely vanish, as she reached out and touched the chilly surface. The caregiver, automatically. With his lamp swinging and creating dancing shadows on the chamber walls, he retreated. Ruth remained still in front of the mirror, looking like an old devotional statue with her silhouette accentuated against the silvery gleam. She started to sway a little in a rhythmic, nearly undetectable fashion, and the caregiver saw that the mirror's reflection was swaying on its own, with a rhythm that was different from Ruth's own. It was like to witnessing two individuals attempting to coordinate a challenging dance across a barrier that subtly but fundamentally warped time. Constance was lying in front of her favorite mirror in the main hall when the caretaker eventually found the strength to climb back to the surface. Her eyes were locked on the fabric covering the reflective surface as though she could see through it to some hidden reality beyond. Yet she wasn't unconscious. Rather, she was in a deep trance. With one hand resting on the handrail, Edmund stood in the middle of the main staircase, gazing into space, with a look of dreadful comprehension, as though at last the pieces of an insurmountable puzzle had fit together in his brain to form a picture that no human should ever see. Whitlock Manor was covered in ever-thickening layers of pure white as the snow continued to fall outside. Any chance of escape or salvation soon vanished along with the outside world. Each member of the family was now lost in their own little mazes of obsession and fractured reality, completing the family's collective insanity. Beneath their dark veils, mirrors pulsed, patient custodians of mysteries beyond human comprehension, somewhere between reality and reflection, between the attic and the basement. Ruth was a living mystery who defied the fundamental rules of identity and nature, existing in unimaginable multiplicity. As though the season itself was hesitant to reach the Whitlock estate, spring 1918 arrived late in the mountains. The snow melted in uneven layers during the slow and excruciating thaw, revealing a countryside changed by months of complete seclusion. The mansion came out of that winter like a wounded animal, its roof displaying holes where the weight of the accumulated snow had caused the tiles to give way and its walls discolored with moisture, under a dead and tangled flora that produced unsettling organic patterns. As if nature were attempting to write coded messages on the deserted earth, the gardens had become nothing more than memories. The caretaker's understanding of linear time had entirely vanished. The days blended together in a fuzzy continuity, where nights and mornings become one and the same. More instinctively than consciously, he went about his daily business, cooking meals that no one ever ate, cleaning rooms that were always dusty, and tending to fireplaces that never seemed to be able to sufficiently warm the cold air that filled the building. His look, with his uncontrollably sprouting gray hair, an unkempt beard covering an overly thin face, and clothes devoid of any semblance of elegance or even basic decency, matched the general state of the property he was now a part of. Of the mansion's furnishings, yet another item lost to decades of disregard. Ruth hardly ever left the attic anymore, but her presence was felt in every part of the house in ways that could not be explained. The caregiver saw her or thought he saw her in many locations at once. While another identical person strolled through the outdoor gardens, a crimson figure passed by the window on the second floor. While its replica moved along the lower hallway, a silhouette stood at the top of the main staircase. He had given up on making amends. These images with any logical comprehension of reality. He merely acknowledged that Ruth, or the person Ruth had transformed into, existed in ways that went beyond the bounds of everyday reality. In a way that contradicted the fundamental vocabulary used to explain existence, she was both one and many, singular and plural, presence and absence entwined. Constance had made the main hall her permanent home, staying close to the Venetian mirror that had become her passion. She dozed out in an armchair. Standing squarely in front of it, she awoke and instantly went back to her peaceful meditation on the black cloth that covered the mirror. She was dressed in clothing that had been lovely in a past life, but her body was clearly withering, the flesh melting off her bones until she was little more than an animated skeleton. Her hands, which were now skeletal claws, moved continuously, creating intricate patterns in the air that appeared to follow a logic that only she understood. Sometimes she made noises that weren't precisely words, syllables that made people physically uncomfortable, guttural vocalizations that sounded like bits and pieces of an old, or possibly future language. In the darkest hours of the night, when even the moon seemed to shun that damned mansion, Edmund had begun to roaming about it. He was frequently seen by the caretaker standing in hallways, staring at blank walls as though they were screens showing movies that only he could see. Edmund muttered continuously, a continuous flow of words that overlapped one another to provide layers of meaning that were difficult to understand. He appeared to be speaking to several individuals at once, responding to inquiries that no one made and refuting charges that no one made. His eyes had gone utterly blank, turning into opaque windows into a mind that had shut itself off from the outside world and made internal labyrinths in which he lived by himself with his own personal ghosts. The covered mirrors started to show unsettling patterns. The materials hiding them moved softly, swaying as though they were touched by breezes that were absent from the mansion's calm air. Occasionally, bulges showed up under the cloths, as though something from the opposite side was pressing against the mirror's surface and attempting to break through the world-to-world barrier. On one occasion, the caretaker saw one of the textiles being pushed out so forcefully that it nearly separated entirely, briefly exposing the silvery surface underneath. For a split second, he saw a warped image of himself that appeared to be screaming instead of his own reflection. Like a prisoner attempting to break free from a dimensional cell, their hands were pressed against the glass on the other side, their mouth open in wordless pain. At last, Ruth came down from the attic with all the diaries she had been studying non-stop. She arranged them with care in the middle of the great hall, forming an unsteady tower of generations' worth of knowledge. As she put the books in exact chronological sequence, starting with the earliest Whitlock family papers dating back more than 100 years. A life and a consciousness that had grappled with the same mysteries that now engulfed the present generation were symbolized by each diary. Ruth read aloud passages for days, her voice resonating through the deserted hallways, telling tales of other Whitlocks who had struggled with duplication, identity fragmentation, and the inability to tell one from another when they had the same face, blood, and inherited curse. The diaries showed recurring patterns, themselves over the decades with unsettling regularity. The Whitlock family had at least one pair of twins born in each generation. Additionally, these twins saw similar events to Ruth's current situation in every generation. Stories of unfathomable simultaneity, seeing one twin in two locations at once, and identities blending and splitting like water trying to find its level. According to certain documents, attempts were made to unravel the riddle by physically separating the twins and relocating one of them. However, the duplication always continued as though a connection that functioned in dimensions other than standard three-dimensional space didn't care about geographic distance. An attempt to disrupt the pattern by drastic means was detailed in one particularly unsettling record from 1847. A distraught patriarch had sought advice from experts in unexplained phenomena, those who worked on the edge of superstition and science. They proposed that the caretaker's enormous mirror in the basement, which, found, was the cause of the issue. Theories that sounded more like mystical philosophy than logical justification said that the mirror had been made centuries ago by craftspeople who were aware of aspects of light and reflection that were yet beyond the current understanding of science. In addition to surfaces, the mirror reflected possibilities, untapped potential, and alternate realities that existed in parallel to the current timeline. In the case of twins, individuals who are already fundamentally identical. Level. The inherent duality was intensified by exposure to such a mirror, creating hazardous resonances that made it impossible to keep distinct borders between the two consciousnesses. Ruth had read those diaries over and over again, taking in the family history as though it held the secret to her own predicament. She started to realize that as long as the mirror in the basement was still there, she wasn't the first one to deal with this. The curse, if it could be called that, was spread by exposure rather than blood. Whitlock's gravid was lured to the basement, to that deep chamber where the huge mirror waited expectantly, with each generation. The pattern was reinforced by each exposure, resulting in new layers of duplication that built over time like geological strata of familial madness. The caregiver started to observe shifts in his own perspective. He saw things he knew couldn't be there, such shadows moving without any light source and reflections on non-reflective surfaces. His own visage, when occasionally seen in polished surfaces or window panes, it appeared odd, as though someone else was wearing his skin as a mask. As if Ruth's own fragmented reality were spreading, causing waves of duplication that affected everything and everyone within the property's radius of influence. He began to wonder more and more if his consciousness was truly his own, or if it had been contaminated by the multiplied presence that dominated the mansion. Outside, spring was coming, but within, time had become erratic and fluid at Whitlock Manor. Impossible hours were displayed as clocks abruptly stopped and restarted. When the day stopped progressing in a straight line, calendars lost their significance. Often, the caretaker was caught in time loops, repeating things he vowed he had already done or leaping ahead to find hours had gone by with no recollection of how he had spent them. The home was separating itself from time, establishing a bubble of its own where traditional cause and effect rules were no longer enforced consistently. Ruth went back to the cellar, and the caretaker did not hesitate to follow her. He needed to face the source of all this lunacy, needed to see the big mirror once more. Together, they dropped into the underground maze, Ruth leading the way with a familiarity that implied innumerable prior trips. As usual, the last chamber waited, its figures reflected in the lantern's flickering light in the colossal mirror. The caretaker had only sensed it before, but now he could see it plainly. In the silvery depths of the mirror, the reflection revealed not two individuals, but numerous incarnations of Ruth, innumerable permutations of herself existing at the same time. The way pieces of identity swirled and recombined into countless permutations was like looking into a human kaleidoscope. Perhaps the original Ruth was present someplace in that unattainable multiplicity, the one consciousness that had been split up and dispersed over dimensions that the human mind was not capable of understanding or navigating. The arrival of summer was stifling and thick. Whitlock Manor was turned into a stone greenhouse in 1919, where decades' worth of unsolved mysteries ripened in the still air. The thick walls allowed the heat to seep in, building up in the chambers until it became difficult to breathe. Despite the oppressive weather, the windows were closed. Day and night became indistinguishable due to the thick drapes that created an endless twilight. The illumination that obtained a sickening and yellowish appearance after escaping through the textiles, as though the property's tainted atmosphere had tainted the light itself. At last, Ruth had decided. She had been getting ready for weeks, collecting certain items from all over the house and carrying them to the basement. Fear had given way to apathy as the caregiver observed her arrivals and departures. Ruth was carrying family journals, antique pictures framed in tarnished silver, and candles made of dark wax that smelled of. Cloths that had formerly covered the mirrors and now had the enigmatic stains that kept spreading, forgotten herbs. In the darkest chamber, every item was meticulously placed around the enormous mirror to form a circular arrangement that followed a geometry only she knew, a design that might only make sense to a mind that had existed concurrently in several realities. Constance was still sitting in front of her covered mirror in the main hall, but her posture had changed significantly. The desperate. There was an unnatural, almost peaceful serenity that had replaced the obsession. She stopped moving and using her skeletal hands to trace designs in the air. She only stared at the black cloth with eyes that appeared to penetrate layers of reality that piled up like sheets of clear glass, seeing through and beyond it. Her body had grown so still that the caregiver frequently had to come closer to see whether she was still breathing, watching the faint movement of her chest to affirm the tenuous existence of life in that increasingly brittle vessel of the human mind. Edmund was no longer roaming at all. He had taken his place at the top of the main staircase, leaning back against the wall on the last step. He could see the entire bottom vestibule and the passageways that branched out in different directions from there. Slowly, his head shifted from side to side, monitoring invisible presences that passed in front of him and following motions that no one else could see. Occasionally, as though he were speaking, his lips moved to create silent words, with things that lived on frequencies that were not normally accessible to the senses, as though Edmund were cataloging something, making notes that would be utilized for unintelligible reasons. The caretaker became more and more uneasy as they passed him. The mansion started to show more and more signs of its own consciousness, as though the whole building were expanding and contracting in regular cycles. Doors opened and closed in rhythms that resembled breathing. The noises, the sounds coming from the walls became louder, not just creaks and the creaks of old wood, but sounds that were almost like spoken words. The caregiver heard mutterings that nearly sounded like words, utterances that lingered on the edge of understanding forever, stirring his thoughts with the promise of significance that never quite came to pass. There were moments when the air itself seemed to vibrate at a frequency that was too low to be audible, but felt in the bones. A throb that matched the heartbeats of those who stayed for a long time, sufficient in the older spaces. During the night, the covered mirrors took on a glowing appearance. The materials that hid them radiated a faint phosphorescence that did not shine, but instead became apparent against the mansion's pitch-black interior without any artificial light. The caretaker found that he could use this ghostly illumination alone to guide him around the halls at night. Each mirror has bright rectangles that stand out like lights in a gloomy sea. The light had a chilly, a contagious feeling that lingered for hours, was an almost damp quality that seemed to stick to the skin of anyone who came too close. At last, Ruth finished getting ready in the basement. The caregiver came down one more time to see her creation. The great mirror room had become something that was at once an altar and a laboratory, a place of worship and a scientific experiment combined in a way that was impossible to describe. The items arranged formed concentric layers of significance around the mirror. A distinct generation of Whitlocks who had battled the curse of duplication was represented by each circle. Ruth had placed the 2 scarlet gowns in the middle of it all, laying them out on the stone floor as though they were worn by unseen bodies, their arms extended in a position of prayer or surrender. The big mirror's surface had changed. It was no longer reflected in the traditional manner. Rather, it revealed unfathomable depths and layers upon layers of reality that extended into the silvery glass indefinitely. There, the caretaker could see innumerable reflections of the room, each slightly different, filled with numerous versions of Ruth acting in uncoordinated ways. She was standing in one layer, kneeling in another, strolling in a third, and just looking back in a fourth. It was similar to thinking about every scenario in which a moment may exist at the same time. the quantum wave function's breakdown revealed by a technology or sorcery that went beyond contemporary. Comprehension. Ruth started moving in a certain circular motion around the mirror. She took deliberate, measured steps, each one precisely positioned as though she were following invisible floor markings. The caretaker became aware that the path she was following reflected the patterns Constance had created in the hallway. All of the family rituals were connected by a hidden geometry, a mathematics of madness that combined personal obsessions into a shared goal that maybe none of them could really comprehend on their own, but which, when combined, they performed with unthinking excellence. The underground chamber's calm air caused the dark wax candles to spontaneously light, their flames remaining immobile. They created odd light, silhouettes of shapes that shouldn't exist in 3 dimensions, and shadows that moved without reference to any source. The caretaker's eyes indicated that everything was horizontal, but he felt a sharp dizziness, as if the floor had tilted at unimaginable angles. Even gravity appeared to be. Turning becomes a negotiating point in that room. The fundamental physics laws. Ruth paused in front of the enormous mirror, flexing under the pressure of forces acting on principles that were not consistent with consensual reality. She reached out with both hands and touched the chilly surface with her open palms. The glass expanded in concentric rings from the point of contact, rippling like disturbed water. After years of disarray, the several incarnations of Ruth that were mirrored in the depths of the mirror started to move in unison. Desynchronization. The caretaker was both fascinated and horrified to see how Ruth's boundaries with her reflections started to blur, her body's substance turning partially translucent, as though she were progressively changing from solid matter to something more fluid and more suited to the non-Euclidean geometries that controlled the interior of the mirror. For the first time in months, Constance went upstairs to the mansion. She approached her covered mirror and in one smooth motion tore the black fabric off. That hid it. Instead of her image, the exposed surface displayed a clear picture of the basement room where Ruth lay. It appeared as though all of the mirrors in the home were joined by folded dimensions, providing a window to every other mirror, regardless of physical barriers or distance. Edmund joined Constance in front of the Venetian mirror after descending the stairs gently. They watched together as events unfolded in the property's underground depths. At last, witnesses assembled for the conclusion of a tale that had taken up all generations of their family tree. The Appalachian mountains were enveloped in a pitch blackness that seemed to suck out all light as night fell. No moon could be seen, and no stars could be seen penetrating the sky's black veil. With windows as gloomy as empty sockets and a massive skull of stone and wood, Whitlock Manor stood lonesome in that great void of darkness. The utter quiet seemed to have a texture, a physical presence that pressed against the eardrums and suppressed any sound before it could develop. Ruth stood in front of the big mirror in the basement, her hands still grazing its rippled surface. Now the glass was entirely fluid, held vertically by forces that defied gravity and rippling like liquid mercury. Instead of reflections, the silvery depths revealed portals openings to places beyond of regular geography. Through those dimensional apertures, the caregiver might see other locations, alternate iterations of the same room, extending in unthinkable directions, each inhabited by a distinct Ruth variation. Now they are moving in perfect unison, as if they were dancing to choreography that has been practiced for ages. Ruth started to blend in with the reflection. According to the calm look on her face, it was a slow, almost tranquil breakdown rather than a violent or traumatic procedure. Her body grew increasingly translucent, the borders of her physical shape becoming less distinct and leaking into the air like water-diluted ink. Her scarlet gown remained vividly colored even as her body's solidity vanished, giving the eerie appearance of empty clothing floating in midair while retaining human shape due to the wearer's recollection. The other incarnations of her that could be seen in the mirror's depths were all going through the same process, dissolving and reconsolidating into a new shape that was partially present in several realities at once. The caregiver couldn't resist the urge to get closer. His feet moved without any conscious thought. Choice, bringing him nearer to the big mirror. The now liquid silver surface radiated an attraction that he could feel, a gravity that drew not the body, but the consciousness, the very thing that made him unique. His memories started to appear before his inner eyes all at once, rather than in a straight line. In an enlarged, perpetual present, every instant of his life existed simultaneously. In the depths of the mirror, he saw his own face mirrored, but infinitely magnified each. Reflection that depicts a little different version of himself and other lives he would have had if he had made other decisions at pivotal points. Constance and Edmund were standing in the main hall upstairs, facing the Venetian mirror that now provided a view of the cellar's depths. From a body constrained by flesh and bone to a consciousness dispersed over interwoven dimensions, they watched Ruth's metamorphosis from unique existence to multiple existence. Constance's skeletal fingers trembled just inches from the glass as she reached out as though she could touch her daughter through the reflecting surface, but she never made contact, as though an unseen barrier kept her from reaching that last frontier. Edmund was finally crushed by the weight of family secrets that had built over centuries, like sediments compressing into the solid rock of inherited madness. He had fallen to his knees, his stance one of total surrender. The additional mirrors that cover the mansions started to emerge on their own. At the same time, the dark materials that covered them fell away, descending to the ground in murmurs of thick fabric. Each exposed reflective surface displayed other scenes, windows to other times or branches of possibilities, rather than the room in which it was situated. The mansion, as it had been decades before, brand new and proud, inhabited by Whitlocks who had not yet succumbed to the curse, was reflected in a mirror in the corridor on the second level. One more in. Decades later, the property was discovered in total ruin in the deserted guest room, collapsing ceiling and crumbling walls. What humanity had attempted to tame is being reclaimed by nature. In the everlasting present that filled their silvery depths, the mirrors, which were broken chronometers, simultaneously displayed every moment of the mansion's history, past and future. The mansion's entire structure started to react to the changes occurring in its basement. Low-frequency vibrations in the walls made. Bones vibrate and teeth hurt, as if the home were being written with symbols in an architectural language that communicated through form and structure. Cracks formed in the plaster and masonry in certain geometric patterns rather than at random. Decades' worth of dust poured from the ceilings, forming clouds that absorbed and warped the scant light. The air thickened and grew hard to breathe, heavy with ozone and something else, a metallic odor that was somewhat like blood. It is more akin to the substance of a fundamental natural law breach. Ruth was fully transformed. What was left of her was neither wholly material nor singular. It was an awareness dispersed throughout the different layers of reality that the mirror connected, a presence that simultaneously occupied multiple spots in space. Fragments of her form appeared and vanished, like glitches in the texture of reality, and the caregiver could see her everywhere and nowhere. She was now what? The fact that she was an entity that existed outside the confines of a single identity and completely embraced the plurality that the Whitlock bloodline held in its blood as a blessing and a curse inextricably entwined may have been her destiny from birth. The basement's big mirror started to enlarge. Its size didn't change physically, but its impact and reach across imperceptible dimensions increased dramatically. The caregiver sensed the desire growing stronger, becoming more than just a compulsion, but a need. He was. It dawned on her that Ruth was being freed by the mirror rather than consumed by it. Her several incarnations eventually came together in a life that accepted paradox rather than attempting to find a solution. And there was an underlying offer in that comprehension, a chance for him to transcend that line on his own, dissolve his own uniqueness, and find out how many other incarnations of himself there may be through the limitless implications of possibility. At last, Constance fell. Her body dropped to the ground like an abandoned rag doll in the main hall. Only an empty vessel remained once all tension was released. Her dying whisper, which carried decades of unsolved issues and truths she had never been able to properly express, was nearly inaudible. Edmund stayed on his knees, staring at the Venetian mirror, which now only reflected his own face, duplicated to infinity in the glass's recursive depths. He observed all the possible incarnations of himself, all the detours, and all the other options that would have resulted in quite different lifestyles, and he saw the same ultimate fate, the same unavoidable collapse into the multitude that waited for every Whitlock in each of these mirrored possibilities. Finally, out of simple survival instinct, the caregiver retreated, bucking the draw of the mirror. With growing haste, he ascended the stone stairs and staggered backward away from the underground chamber. He had to get out of there before the mirror took over his mind. Prior to his own identity, he broke apart into innumerable iterations dispersed among multiple universes. Breathless and confused, his mind unable to comprehend what he had seen in the depths, he emerged on the bottom floor of the mansion. Whitlock Manor was no longer merely a physical building. Several realities now touched and bled into one another at this nexus, a point of convergence. When not in direct view, the corridor's layout changed. In what should have been solid walls, doors emerged. There were staircases leading to floors that weren't supposed to be there. Known the property's architecture. The caretaker was lost in his own home and couldn't figure out how to get out. Every hallway took him farther into the maze that had become the manor. Before he could determine if they were reflections, shadows, or actual other selves from nearby worlds, he saw versions of himself turning bends ahead, always too distant to grasp, and always vanishing. At last, Edmund got up from the main hall floor. He went to the main entrance of the mansion and threw it open. First time in many years. There was complete and unbreakable darkness outside, yet he entered without hesitation, his figure growing increasingly blurry until it vanished entirely into the black emptiness. No one would ever know if he had come across something in the hazy mountains, whether he had made it down the hill toward the far-off settlements, or whether he had just vanished into the night like smoke in the wind. He left quietly and completely, leaving thee. The mansion was even more deserted than before. At last, the caretaker discovered a window on the second story that provided a clear view of the exterior. He stared at the Appalachian mountains that loomed in all directions, their summits covered in a persistent mist, their deep valleys containing secrets amassed over centuries of human habitation. There were countless of mysteries hidden in the dark corners of those old mountains, and the Whitlock estate was just one of them. He realized that the tale of Ruth, her family, and all the Whitlocks who had battled the curse of duplication were only one strand in a much wider tapestry of oddity woven throughout that remote part of the globe. The cellar's candles all went out at once, leaving the underground space completely dark. The big mirror stopped rippling, its surface hardening again into silvery glass that was flawlessly smooth. In its depths, however, something had changed radically. It now displayed reflections of locations that were not real in the physical world. Unthinkable vistas that extended into dimensions beyond the scope of Euclidean geometry. And somewhere in those depths was Ruth, free to inhabit multiplicity instead of being constrained by the singularity of identification. She experienced all the lives she may have had at once, as her consciousness expanded over an endless number of different possibilities of herself. In the Highlands, Whitlock Manor would continue to deteriorate with time and in the face of the elements, yet its walls and mirrors would retain the echoes of all that had taken place inside. When future visitors eventually found the deserted property, they would experience an unexplained uneasiness when passing through its quiet hallways. When they stared directly at the movements they saw in the corner of their vision, they would disappear. They would hear murmurs that seemed as though they were coming from everywhere at once. And they would see their own reflections if they were stupid enough to go down to the deepest chamber in the dungeon, where the enormous mirror waited expectantly. Replicated indefinitely, all the possible incarnations of themselves through the consequences of destiny. And maybe, just maybe, they would also catch a glimpse of Ruth, still living in those silvery depths, a timeless presence both imprisoned and liberated by the mystery that had engulfed her family for generations. Dawn came with a gray light that hardly broke through the eternal mist, and the caretaker finally left the mansion. Without turning around, he strolled along the street, taking with him memories that would grow less clear over time, much like dreams that disappear when you wake up. When he finally arrived to the closest village, he would spin jumbled tales about the Whitlocks that no one would ever believe. Tales that would be stored away in the mind as the hyperbole of a man who had been damaged by years of seclusion on a distant estate. The Whitlock mansion would eventually become just another local folk tale. Another story circulated in bars about weird creatures that live in the historic Appalachian mountains, locations where mysteries wait patiently for those who are stupid enough to look for them, reality is thinner than elsewhere. Like so many stories before her, Ruth Whitlock's story vanished into the mist, and the mountains are good at keeping secrets. However, the mirrors and reflections are still there, and somewhere in the depths of the silvery glass, multiplicity awaits those who look too long, who wonder about their own uniqueness, and who are drawn to the insatiable curiosity of learning how many different versions of themselves there are. Possibilities that split off to form the fabric of reality. For future travels through the dark mysteries that lurk in the forgotten corners of this planet, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like if this unnerving narrative made you feel something, or if the shadows of Appalachia captured your imagination. Which element of this story most impressed you? Tell us in the comments section below. And until we cross paths on the boundaries between the known and the unexplainable again.